Plant biomass, an introduction to measuring biomass on rangelands. Biomass is the total weight of living organisms in an area at a given time. It includes both living plant and animal materials, and also includes those materials that are found above as well as below ground. Plant biomass is a very important attribute of rangelands and rangeland vegetation. In this lesson, we will be focusing exclusively on plant biomass. Now, terms that you may hear used interchangeably when we're discussing plant biomass are also production as well as yield. These terms have different definitions and different connotations, but they do share in common the same basic unit that we measure biomass production and yield in terms of weight over a unit area. The most common units used to measure biomass are kilograms per hectare, pounds per acre, or grams per meter squared. Biomass is valued as an indicator of ecological processes as well as management effectiveness. As an ecological indicator, biomass provides important information about fundamental ecological processes, energy capture, as well as water and nutrient cycling. That's because plants are our primary producers of the world that convert solar energy to chemical energy. And so in order to take the business of energy capture, they also require water and nutrients. Therefore, biomass, the amount of biomass reflects energy capture as well as water and nutrient use. Because of its role as an indicator of these processes, it's also used as an indicator of species dominance. We generally assume that species that have the most biomass are the ones that are dominant in the area because of their access to these fundamental resources. Biomass can also provide information about the amount of carbon that is stored on a site. It's also informative about hydrologic function, as well as the potential for conversion of plant biomass to animal biomass, so secondary production. Biomass also has an influence on fire regimes, both because of the amount of biomass on an area and how it is distributed, but also the kind of biomass. So fine fuels versus woody fuels, how the biomass is organized and spatially arranged can greatly influence fire regime. As a management indicator, we use biomass to provide information when we are assessing rangeland condition and rangeland health. And that's because both of these assessments use species composition information that is based on relative amounts of biomass. Plant biomass is an indicator that is used to inform livestock management. We use the forage inventories to determine stocking rates, and also the distribution of biomass can provide information about animal distribution or livestock distribution. Wildlife habitat suitability is also informed by biomass because this is an important component of the requirements for different species. And in terms of fire management, both fuels management as well as prescribed fire, biomass is a very important and informative indicator. Now, there are a number of different terms that are used when we discuss biomass, and these are just a few. We'll look at some more in turn. Phytomass is a term that's used specifically to describe the amount of plant material in an area, and it includes both above and below ground biomass, as well as attached dead material. Production is a term that is often used interchangeably with biomass, and in this case we're talking about the biomass that was produced through primary production. Usually when we are discussing production, we focus on the amount of above ground material that we see, but it does include production of below ground material as well. Yield is a term that's also used that includes information or is influenced by the concept of harvest. So it is the quantity of something that is produced, so biomass that's produced in a given space, and it references harvest in that we usually think of either mechanically harvesting or harvesting through the consumption by herbivores. Other terms that are used specific to biomass are mostly focused on what we measure and also why we measure it. And so we're going to look at some of these terms in closer detail, especially in light of how they are measured. Standing crop, current year's growth, herbage, browse, forage, and residual biomass are all different forms or approaches to consider biomass. Now, it's important to remember when we're talking about biomass or when we're talking about production that a lot of production occurs both above and below ground. In some systems, particularly more arid systems, the amount of production that occurs below ground is often far greater than the production that occurs above ground. For example, if you look at this diagram of Scleropogon brevifolius or burrow grass, we can see that the amount of biomass below ground far exceeds the amount of biomass of an individual plant above ground. Although below ground biomass is extremely important and should be taken into consideration, it is something that is very difficult to measure. And for most rangeland measurements and monitoring applications, we focus on above ground biomass or above ground production. Let's consider the term standing crop. Standing crop is the total amount of above ground plant material in a unit area at a unit time. Now, this may be modified using terms such as dead standing crop or live standing crop, depending on what it is that we're actually trying to measure. So, for example, you can see here in terms of standing crop, we would measure from the soil surface on all of these plants, both herbaceous and woody plants, in order to measure the amount of standing crop. Current year's growth is a term that refers to the amount of above ground plant material that's produced during a 12-month period. Sometimes you may hear this called annual production, and when we go to measure current year's growth, we have to remove or ignore the production, the biomass that was produced in previous years. So for example, if we look at the grass on the left, we would not want to consider that biomass that was produced the year before. And so there it is again. You can see that brown material, we would have to remove that from our consideration from our measurement. So if we were measuring current year's growth of herbaceous plants, we would measure from the soil surface on these 3 herbaceous plants. Current year's growth on shrubs includes usually the twigs and the leaders and the leaves that were produced in this specific year. Herbage refers to the above ground material of any herbaceous plants and does not include any information about palatability or preference. So here, when we're looking at herbage, we would measure the above ground material of these 3 herbaceous plants. Browse refers to the parts of the leaves and the twigs on woody plants that are available for animal consumption. Now, forage is a special term, usually referring to either herbage or browse or both, but it includes the caveat that the material must be available as forage as well as acceptable as a food for either grazing or browsing animals. And so animal preference and availability of or accessibility of the material is important. For example, if we were to look at the forage of herbaceous plants here, we were measuring forage. First of all, we generally don't measure it at the soil surface, but we measure it usually about at an inch above the ground. And we would measure these 2 plants because they are available for a grazing animal. This plant here is not available to a grazing animal if you would assume that this shrub is actually going to impede an animal from being able to get to that grass, and so it would not be included in a measurement of herbaceous forage. Browse, again, would be that woody material that's available and found palatable by specific animals. And so in this case, we may not consider this up here, even though these may be palatable, depending on the grazing animal and its ability to reach these areas. This may not be considered in an inventory of browse forage. Same thing here. If you assume that this shrub is actually 3-dimensional and it may be difficult for an animal to reach in to get to this twig, leader, and leaves, then that would not be included in a forage inventory of browse. Now, residual biomass is the weight of vegetation that's remaining after grazing or harvest has been completed. And so here what we see is an illustration of what, at the end of the grazing season, at the end of the season of use, what we would measure would be the residual biomass of usually herbaceous species. And residual biomass is important because it provides information about the amount of plant material that is available to continue growth in the next year. It also provides information about site protection, the soil conservation, and protection from erosion. In certain systems, we sometimes include litter with the above ground, what's remaining of the above ground herbaceous material in our estimates of plant residue or residual biomass. And again, this just points out the importance of clearly defining the measurements that you're going to take, what is being included, as well as considering why you are collecting the information that you're collecting. There are certain ground rules that need to be followed or considered when measuring biomass. First of all, we've just covered what we measure. If we're measuring standing crop, annual production, forage, residue, etc., that's going to influence a lot of decisions about whether we include live and dead material or just focus on the live material. Also, clipping height, as I mentioned before, for forage estimates, usually we clip at 1 inch above the ground, as you can see here, rather than at the soil surface. The date that we sample is also an important consideration. Usually we want to sample at the end of the growing season. Ideally, we would like to be able to estimate peak standing crop. And that is when, for an individual species, the date at which the largest amount of standing crop exists on a site. Now, peak standing crop, it's difficult to estimate peak standing crop for all species because of phenological differences. Plants peak at different times, or certainly at different dates, and so usually we try to estimate peak standing crop by measuring standing crop at the end of the growing season. But you want to make sure that we select the sampling date with consideration of when biomass is going to be at its peak. If we wait too long, we'll start to have decay of plant materials. Whether we separate species or not is also a consideration. Usually when we're doing biomass estimates, we are estimating the amount of biomass on a species by species basis. Now, depending on your purpose, you may find that it is acceptable to lump certain species together. So for example, if you're doing a forage inventory, and depending on the scale of the inventory or the amount of detail that you're getting, you may lump species together that are similar in terms of their overall forage value, or by different functional groups. Another thing that's important is that when we estimate biomass, we do it on a dry weight basis. Now, this can be difficult because plants have moisture, and we need to be able to accommodate or to account for the amount of moisture in plant materials. So often we do this either by harvesting in the field, taking a fresh weight, and then drying the plant material, either air drying it or oven drying it, in order to remove the moisture content and then be able to get a correction factor on how much dry weight biomass there is in the harvested materials or in the materials that we estimated on the ground. These considerations will be covered in greater detail in future lessons. Now, there are 4 major types of measurement methods: harvesting and estimation, as well as double sampling and indirect methods. And these will be covered in greater detail in subsequent lessons.